Thank you for listening to Upaya's Dharma podcasts, an extraordinary series of talks from some of the finest Buddhist teachers in the world. I'm Joan Halifax, founder of Upaya Zen Center, and we're so happy to make these podcasts available to you. If you find this talk of benefit, please consider making a donation to support us to continue offering these recordings freely. You'll find a donation button on our podcast page. And thank you so much for listening.
This is Dharma Podcast at dharmapodcast.org. This is show number 1045. It was recorded on October 22nd, 2014, and it is titled Cultivating of Wisdom. The speaker for this episode is Sean Murphy.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. Can everyone hear me okay? Anya, is there a timepiece available? I don't have a watch, so I don't run over. So, yes, the topic for tonight's talk, I have to come up with these topics a long time ahead of time. So what I came up with about some months ago when we talked about doing this talk was the cultivation of wisdom. And in Buddhism, it's said that wisdom grows naturally out of practice, and so in some sense it doesn't need to be cultivated. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you all for coming. I want to lead you through a couple of guided practices that illustrate this principle and how it works. How many people here have a regular meditation, Zen meditation practice? Oh, okay. How many people have some other style of meditation practice? Okay. How many people don't meditate but just accidentally wandered in here thinking it was a branch of the Devarga small? Okay, so we have some fairly experienced practitioners here. That's good. One of the things that happened in my research for my book, One Bird, One Stone, and through being at Naropa, is I got a broader exposure to different styles of practice than a lot of people experience. And so one of the things I've been doing, I'm fortunate enough to teach meditation for credit at the college level. Some semesters I have 3 college classes and in meditation. It's kind of amazing. The world is changing at UNM Taos. So, and one of the things that happened from having a broad range of exposure, and also I often co-teach with a Vipassana teacher in Taos, and so I have some exposure to that style too. One of the things that's happening in this country now is that we're, with these different traditions that have been separate, for instance, Tibetan practice, Vipassana or insight meditation and Zen meditation, having been separate, developed separately, and then coming together, is we have the richness of what's been developed in each of the practices. But sometimes also what's been lost in some of the practices can kind of repollinate. So in working with lay students, I've developed certain ways of pointing to aspects of practice that I'd like, some of which we don't always hear in Zen practice. So I'd like to share some of that with you. First of all, let's just do a meditation practice together. So for the purposes of this, it's good. Who's making that noise? Oh, I am. Okay. All right. For the purposes of this practice, let's just go back to our usual beginning place of practice, which is the breath. And what I want to illustrate is something that's not that commonly spelled out in Zen, which is that there are two two different avenues into deep practice. And the depths of practice is where the wisdom arises. So I want to clarify these two different avenues in for you. So the first one is concentrative practice. This is what we do it's usually how we begin in Zen practice, and in many other styles of practice, we begin by trying to focus our attention on the breath and to try and keep our attention there. So it's a one-pointed style of practice, or concentrated practice. But just for a couple of minutes, I'd like us to practice that way. And it really helps to keep our attention steadily on the breath. So it's very common for the attention to fluctuate somewhere during the breath cycle. For instance, many people find that their attention focuses up on the out-breath and perhaps is very focused at the pause before the in-breath. And then may waver or fluctuate on the in-breath. Other people have exactly the reverse experience. It doesn't matter which is yours, but to try and keep the attention continuous throughout the breath cycle is a useful way to access depth more consistently and more quickly in practice. So, for instance, early in my practice, I noticed that the bottom of the breath, where the lungs are empty, was a particularly concentrated and rather full-feeling moment in practice. And so it's possible to connect with that and to try and carry that quality of focused attention around the whole breath cycle. Now, if you practice this way for even a few minutes, especially when we've just been sitting and in a practice center like this that supports deep practice, we might find a certain sense of focused stillness starting to become available to us. So when we start to feel that focused stillness, it's okay to allow ourselves to sink into that and to, in a sense, let that become the object of our meditation. So we're still aware of the breath coming and going, but we're very immersed in that sense of focus and stillness. And so then we just try to stay with that sense of focused stillness as continuously as we can, because that continuity of attention leads to depth. One of the things that I observe sometimes when speaking to groups is that people sometimes get caught in the technique, in this case, following the breath. And when that sense of depth and stillness opens up, it's helpful to signal that in some way that's the destination, that's where we're headed. because some people get caught in the practice. So really that sense of stillness is the door to samadhi or deeper focus. It's the feeling that arises when we're passing through that door to the depth of practice that we call samadhi or deep absorption. But some people never go through that door because when it starts to happen, they go back to the breath. So really we focus down on one thing, the breath, so that that sense of stillness and focus becomes available. And then it's as though a certain door swings open and we step through there and rest in the silence and just let that deepen. Okay, so I want to wipe the slate clean and come back to normal talking mode. Just so we have a chance to check in about that. How many people could connect with what I was pointing to with the silence and stillness? Okay. All right. So, how many people found it pleasant? Find it pleasant, okay. So, in traditional Buddhism, that's spoken as one of the fruits of practice, that pleasant feeling of absorption. So, it's good to always have some of that focused, one-pointed practice in one's meditation practice, because it gives one the strength of concentration. It's like building a certain muscle. We bring our attention there and then we hold it. How many people it made sense that once you touch that, you could just kind of decide to stay there with some sense of continuity? Does that make sense? How many people knew what I was talking about? Okay. That's a useful way to practice. Having practiced that way for some time now, certain times I don't have to use the breath. I just sit down and I wait for that. It does feel like a door opening. I just wait for the stillness to arise and just go into it. And it's okay to move into practicing that way. And many people get caught in the technique. It's one of the things I'm pointing to is the technique of focusing down the awareness to one thing is meant to lead to that deeper state. So I'm going to wipe the slate clean. And talk about the other form of practice, which is an expansive form of practice. And in Soto Zen, this corresponds to the kind of practice that we call just sitting. We may begin with the breath, but it's a broader focus. So I'd like to do a practice around that, just to illustrate the difference between the two. And it's said in traditional Buddhism that the concentrative practice, although it's kind of necessary, it's like building up the muscles so we can do the other kind of practice, it doesn't tend to lead to insight. The what we call just sitting practice or in Vipassana practice, it's actually that practice of being aware of one's sensations and in a broad way, the rising and falling of sensation that we call Vipassana practice. That's their corresponding, traditional Buddhism's corresponding practice to what we call just sitting in Soto Zen. So just to illustrate that kind of practice, and this practice is said to be where wisdom tends to grow from, is doing the broader form of practice. So again, just to get us started, again, let's focus on the breath. And for these purposes, it's good to begin with a very crisp object of focus. If you've ever done the counting practice, where you count the breath, inhale 1, exhale 2, inhale 3, exhale 4, it can be useful to use that just to access the beginning of this. If you're not accustomed to that, just focus on the breath in a fairly close fashion. It helps to physicalize it, to find the breath somewhere in the body. Okay, now I'd like you to notice that there are two factors going on in our consciousness. When we do this, we focus on an object, say the breath, but also we're aware of the object. So it's as though it seems to us that the object that we're focusing on is located in a larger field that we could call a field of awareness. And a good analogy to it is the relationship that sound has to silence. So notice it's pretty silent in this room, which corresponds to the larger field. But then a sound may arise in the silence. That bird or whatever we're hearing. So notice that the silence is actually undisturbed by the sound. In our normal consciousness, we tend to collapse into what arises in the field of silence. So we tend to rivet our attention on the sound and lose awareness of the fact that there's a larger space of silence that's undisturbed by it. In the same way, the breath, or whatever our object of awareness, appears to us to arise in a larger field of awareness. So our normal human conditioning bends us towards being aware of the object of awareness, but not of awareness itself. So we use this awareness all the time, but we tend to notice what we're aware of. We tend not to notice awareness itself. So for now, I'd like you to notice the awareness itself in the same way that we may notice the silence that surrounds sounds. Or in the same way that a painter may notice the negative space on a canvas rather than just the objects that are the subject of the painting. So it's like going to the background instead of putting our attention on the foreground. So I'd like you to notice that field of awareness. I'm going to ask you some questions about that field of awareness. And some of you may have heard me do a version of this before. If so, just bear with me again, please. So I'm going to ask a few questions about this larger field of awareness. The first is, how far does it extend? Does it seem to have any edges or boundaries? And if it does, is there anything beyond those apparent edges or boundaries? Notice if there's a quality of dark or light associated with it. If you had to put a name to the feeling quality of being in this large space of awareness that we sometimes call in Zen original mind or big mind, what would the feeling quality be if you had to put a name to it? Does this larger space have a quality of warmth or coldness, or is it neutral? And finally, the big trick question, what time is it there? Okay, so now I want to ruin this experience by talking about it. For the purpose of giving us some tools so that when we go away from a practice center, we can learn to access this more consistently on our own. How many people could felt like they could connect with that larger space when I pointed to it? Okay. If you had trouble connecting with it, that's okay. The place to look for it is, for instance, when a thought comes through the mind, we're aware of the thought, right? So there's two apparent things happening. One is that there's a thought. The other is that we're aware of it. Does that make sense? So we say a thought appears in our mind. That's what I'm pointing to. What we call the mind is that large space of awareness that the thought seems to float into so that we become aware of it, right? So again, another way of helping to connect to it or remember it is this is the mind we were born with. When we were born, we didn't know how to think. We didn't know what separate objects were, but we were perfectly aware, right? Yeah. Before we learned language, we didn't know words, we didn't have memories, we didn't have projections into the future. We actually saw the world, we didn't even know things were separate in the world or that we were separate from it. So we were born with that large mind of awareness and we started loading things into it. All our learning is loaded into it. So there's two kinds of wisdom in Buddhism. One is conventional wisdom. That's all the stuff that we load into that mind. And the other is absolute wisdom, which is what we're practicing here. That's the wisdom that arises from reconnecting with that larger mind or original mind, if you want to call it that. So, so I'd like to hear from some people. What were if you had to, let's start with the feeling quality. If you had to give a name to the feeling quality of that larger awareness, what's the feeling quality? Anyone? Contentment, okay. Yes? Uh-huh. Serenity, okay. Expansiveness, okay. Permeable porousness, that's nice, okay, yeah. Anyone else? Vastness, okay. Quiet, okay. Energy, all right. So, as far as asking about whether it had any edges or how far it extended, anybody want to answer that? How far did that mind extend? Infinite, okay. Anyone else? Boundless, yes, you? Okay, all right, good. So this is, people often have sensory experiences like darkness or light or color, which is why I ask those questions. There's not a right or wrong answer to those questions. It's mostly because I'm trying to get us to signal what it's like for us when we touch that space. And if we signal what it's like when we touch that space, you have to understand you can't grasp after going back there. You can't go, oh, there it is, ah! You know, that clutching won't work, but you can ease into that space when it opens up for you. And the feeling is much like easing into sleep. You can't grasp after sleep, right? Or relaxing a tight muscle. You can't go, come on, muscle, come on. You know, it doesn't work. You have to, it's a bit like that. So there's a lot of caution in meditation practice against grasping, and it's good caution. But that doesn't mean you can't practice accessing that kind of deep space that we're talking about now. You just have to do it without clutching. You know, It's there are ways to find it and enter it. Let's see. Somebody already spoke to qualities of dark or light. How about temperature? Warm. You thought coolness? Okay. You thought warmth? Okay. So again, this is just a way to signal for yourself what that feels like for yourself, and that may change also. How about qualities of darkness or light? Somebody said, did you say light or did you say darkness?
Well, it's kind of like this, and then it's kind of like those pictures you see in space at the end.
Oh,
There's black colors and land masses.
okay. Anyone else? Yes.
What comes to my mind is it's like driving on the road at night where you're illuminated, and then it begins to take you out of the light, but you have a sense of space.
Yeah. So okay. So good. And so the last, the trick question is, what time is it there? Now, or where there is no time. It's kind of a sense of an eternal space, isn't it? I actually think of it as, if you want to know what the fifth dimension is, that's the way I think of it. It's a dimension that we're aware of, the eternal dimension. And we try to explain it to ourselves in different ways. That's what all the religions are attempts to do, is that sense of being eternal. They're attempts, in my view, to explain the fact that we can connect with that eternal space. Because when we explain it, we kind of ruin it, and then we start arguing. It's warm. No, it's cool. No, it's warm. No, it's cool. Next thing, you're at war, right? Okay. The eternal space doesn't actually care about a distinction such as that. So the reason that I like to delineate these two avenues into practice is in traditional Buddhism, and also that in Tibetan Buddhism, they often emphasize practicing both. We don't quite delineate it that way in Zen, but I find it's helpful to do that. Sometimes we find ourselves in this really focused space, and that's an entry point into our practice, and sometimes we find ourselves in this really expanded space. So it's said that the focused style of practice is important in building the muscle so that when we practice a larger space, that we can stay there, that we can remain there. It's said in traditional Buddhism that the larger space is what gives rise to insight. This is why Vipassana is also called insight meditation, is because that larger space tends to give rise to insight. So the question becomes, how does it give rise to insight? So what do you notice in touching this space? How do I point to this? Okay, so let me point to it this way. If that larger space is infinite, and if it's our awareness, right? It's the awareness function that we use to drive a car, to shop, to clean our kitchens, to whatever we do, right? We use that awareness function all the time. But we tend to be focused on the object of awareness, and we tend to have lost sight of the larger space. Does that make sense? Okay. So we were born with a larger space, and we gradually just learned to focus down and focus, which was good training, don't get me wrong, that's conventional wisdom. But what makes a house useful, for instance, when we move into a house, is the space, right? And then after we've lived in the house for 10 years or so, it's all cluttered with so much stuff, we don't see the space anymore. But does the space go anywhere? The space is still there, it's just filled in with stuff. So our minds are much like that. So, and there's good reason that we're conditioned to see what stands out against the background. For instance, let's go back 10,000 years. You're walking across this hill here, and something moves against the background. It's more important than the background, right? Because what moves against the background, you're going to either eat, fight with, mate with. That's about it, isn't it? Or be eaten by, so what stands out against the background is important for our survival. So the thing is, by the time we're adults, we tend to have lost sense of the larger awareness. So when we connect back to that larger awareness, which is a main focus of meditation, especially in Soto Zen sitting meditation, just sitting, is connecting with that larger awareness. And sure, the breath is still happening, but other objects of awareness may come through and leave. We call it meditation without an object, without a particular object, right? It doesn't matter what comes through the field. We're holding the field, the larger field. So if that field feels infinite, light extends infinitely, and I'm using that field to look out through my eyes to be aware of all of you. And here's Anya sitting in front of me, and she's using her awareness to look out at me. And her awareness is infinite, and my awareness is infinite. What does that say about our awareness? Same thing. Same thing. Her awareness and my awareness are identical. They run into each other. They run into each other. Not you, but no, everybody's, right? Everybody's awareness runs into the next person's awareness. So what insight comes from that? Connectedness, yeah. One mind, yeah. Connectedness, one mind. Those are things to call it. Okay. So what this means is I'm not really separate from Anya or Roshi or whoever else is out in the audience. You're not really separate from the next person. And there's a way to actually access that through our meditation and actually to re-access it. If you want to re-access it again, I found this so helpful when I stumbled upon it or kind of assembled it from talking to 100 different teachers. I don't know exactly how it came together, but before then it would sometimes happen and sometimes it wouldn't. And I didn't quite know what was happening or what made it happen, It finally clicked for me, if I happen to be upset, if you're upset about something, are you aware of being upset? Sure you are. So can you practice the larger field even if you're upset? You can try. Sometimes the upset's so big it sucks us in. So when we lose ourselves in upset or when we're overwhelmed by emotion, that's what it's like, right? We've lost sense of the larger field. But does the larger field go anywhere? No, it doesn't go anywhere. It's waiting for us if we could just pull ourselves out of that obsession with our own suffering or our own problem or whatever it is. I find it really helpful when I find myself in suffering or confusion or difficulty, or when I find myself thinking or feeling obsessively about something. Wait a minute, I'm aware of this. If I'm aware of this, the bigger field's there. If I can put my attention to the larger field, then my individual problem that was so consuming maybe falls into some kind of perspective and isn't so overwhelming. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because then, all of a sudden, my problem's the same as Anya's problem, or Roshi's problem, or Kenzan's problem, or whoever's. In a certain sense, what happens from practicing that big mind, or that one mind, or original mind, there's all sorts of words for it. One of the things that happens is we start to have a more neutral attitude towards our own problems, because if we really get and we practice and then we go and check this awareness against our practice the next time we practice, this wisdom begins to become more embodied. It's like, it's not just me. My consciousness is everyone. It runs into everyone. So what starts to happen is when we have an issue, it's not quite such a big drama. The other thing to notice is that when I have an issue, let's go back to the sound and silence thing. Did that make sense when I was pointing to the sound and silence? Is that those are a larger field. We hear the bird call, but there's still silence, and then the bird call falls back into silence. Okay, we're conditioned to see what stands out against the background. Same thing as in our internal awareness, for very good reason. However, the silence is undisturbed by the sound, really. And even in a big city, if you look for silence, you'll find it. That's how we know one sound separate from the next, because there's space. When our mind seems consumed by thoughts, anybody ever feel like you got 1,000,000 thoughts in your mind? Or 1,000 thoughts, or hundreds of thoughts? Okay, how do you know there are hundreds of thoughts? Because there's space between them. Otherwise, how many thoughts would there be? It would just be one thought. right? There's a million because it's like trains. So there's one car, there's another, there's another, there's another, there's another. There's actually space. If you look for the space is there. So, so that larger mind or original mind or that big awareness, is it disturbed by our problems? Not disturbed by our problems, no. So you could even say that there's not such a thing as an individual self in that large mind. That's just not the way it operates. Sure, there's this experience that we have of being an individual self, and we can go back to that any time, but there's also this completely different experience that's available to us, which we practice in meditation. Now, when I say we were born with that mind, that's not an enlightened mind when we're born with it. It's just a child's mind. The child doesn't know it's aware that it's experiencing oneness because it doesn't know anything to compare it to. So the human journey is we're born into awareness, or you can call it a state of grace, and then we learn distinction. At some point we learn, I'm an individual self. My name is Sean. I'm an American. I speak English. I have a mom. I have a dad. They do this. They do that. When we begin to re-practice the larger awareness and re-access it, that's what we're doing in meditation. And that's where the strength and power comes from doing that. So that large mind of awareness, is it okay for me to call it a mind? Does it feel like it's aware? Feels like it's aware. So in some sense, you could kind of call it a big mind or original mind. That's why we talk about it in those terms in Buddhism. So in theistic traditions, what do they call that experience? So does Buddhism have any argument with theistic traditions? Same thing. It's not like we have one brand of oneness here and everybody has one brand of oneness there. A different brand of oneness there, When we touch that sense of the eternal, there's a natural tendency to want to explain it. What we tend to do in Buddhism is not explain it, because when we explain it, to some degree, we diminish it. We start to imprison it again in the web of concepts. So we tend not to explain it or personify it. And yet, if you ever think, does it ever occur to you, well, some branches of Buddhism, Zen has less of a requirement to believe in reincarnation. We kind of have a choice to or not to, right? And then so that's Buddhism's explanation or Hinduism's explanation for that sense of the eternal. Because when we touch the eternal, it feels like, well, I go on, I don't die. There's something eternal here, But when we personalize it, then all of a sudden we get ourselves forced into an explanation like, well, therefore I must be reborn again and I must have lived before because I have this strong sense of the eternal. I have this strong sense that there's something eternal to my consciousness that I don't pass, In Christianity, they have a different explanation for that same connection with the eternal. Oh, I have the sense of eternal, therefore I must not die, therefore it must happen later in heaven, right? But there's actually no requirement to explain it. And once we explain it, we start arguing. We tend we have this tendency again to argue with the next explanation over, right? So in Zen in particular, we tend not to explain that experience. We just go back and revisit the experience. We have a few minutes left. Are there any questions or comments about what we just did? Yes,
Just wondering, so as a baby, the baby would probably zoom focus, right? Really like nice sensation, warm milk, something like that?
Yeah, something moves against this apparently unified field and they start to learn, oh, that's standing out, and eventually they learn, oh, that means it's separate, yeah. Or,
before that, there's probably some kind of
Well, it's known really scientifically that when infants are born, they don't really know there's a distinction between mom and themselves or between themselves and the environment, right? That's a learned distinction, It's necessary to learn that because that's survival, right? That's why infants are so helpless. Sorry, they don't, they can't defend themselves. They don't even know there's anything to defend yet. We recapture that sense of unity, but when we recapture it as adults, having been all the way through the whole arc of development, then we recognize, what this means in a way that we can't when we're infants, right? So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Could you relate it into Vedanta that what we're focusing on, so as we're born and then we focus on milk or we focus on this or that, and at the same time our focus becomes more one-pointed or refined, that then the consciousness and awareness is expanding at the same time.
The two factors always exist in our minds, the expansiveness and the focus. It's just we tend to lose sight of the expansiveness because we become so fixated on the objects of awareness. Yeah, we use that awareness all the time. It functions all the time. We couldn't do anything if we didn't use it. It's just that we don't tend to notice the big picture. We tend to notice what we're focused on. You had a question? Joshin, right? Yeah. Hi. Yeah.
Not so much about the meditation techniques you talked about, but I'm curious that you kept referring to traditional Buddhism as opposed to Zen or Tibetan.
Theravadan meaning, Theravadan Buddhism. Yeah. Traditional, the original Buddhism. That, yeah. Yeah, of course, Zen's traditional, but it's only traditional 1,000 or so years back, the prior tradition, which of course has also changed, and who knows what we specifically know about that, what's been passed down to us that appears to be the tradition that's upheld. Yeah, they tend to, though, in Theravada or Vipassana, clarify the distinction more than we do, between focused practice and expansive practice. Even though we do it. I guess we are out of time. So thank you all. So try practicing this at home when you feel like you can't practice, when you can't get your mind focused. Try and remember that you're aware that you can't get your mind focused. Wait a minute, that larger field is right there. If you remember that. It's the kind of thing we tend to forget it. Like we'll go home and we'll go, what was he saying? Huh? But look for it a few times and you'll start to understand it. You'll start to understand what I'm pointing to. Wait a minute, I'm aware of, now there is a problem with this, which is, that's the way it appears, that an object appears in a larger awareness, but the object and the larger awareness actually aren't separate either. But still, that's the way it appears to us, and it's a useful way to, in our conventional human consciousness, that's the way it appears. There's an object and there's the big awareness. Again, to go back to traditional Buddhism, sometimes it's talked about the observer or the witnessing consciousness or the witness. So that's what we're practicing here. What's important is not to make another self out of the witnessing consciousness, right? Not to make more separation out of it. It's a kind of illusion that the awareness has objects in it. It's all one substance. It's all energy smooshing into each other. Smooshing is a traditional Buddhist term. So we are out of time. It's a pleasure talking with you all. I do have some brochures about my the Meditation Leader Certification Program that I'm doing with the blessing of my Zen teachers and lineage. The basic requirement is 5 years of meditation experience. And it's a training similar to what your average yoga teacher goes through. Your average yoga teacher goes through a training that doesn't make them a spiritual teacher. It makes them somebody who can teach the techniques of yoga. that's what we're trying to do, because I've been practicing Zen for 27 years, and I'm just on the edges of the formal process to become a formal teacher. So not everybody can spend 27 years, and there's so much growing interest in meditation that I believe that it can be useful, that there's many people who never go through the whole process to become a formal teacher, but could be very good at teaching the simple techniques of meditation to another person. And so that's what we're doing, is a training program to do that. And we are just starting up, we meet every other week in Taos. We're just starting up a new series for this. But also, if you can't come to Taos every other week, we also have a summer intensive, which is a month-long intensive, where we do the same as 200 hours training, similar to what yoga teachers do. So I have brochures on that. And I also have some copies of my book, if any of you would like to talk to me about that. Thank you all for your attention. It's a pleasure to practice with you.